And so moving on here to the next chapter of Spengler. With chapter 8, we have Problems of the Arabian Culture B, the Magian Soul. And at this point, we're two-thirds of the way through the entirety of Decline of the West, so we've got about a third of the way to go, 7 more chapters. And at this point now, in the previous chapter, which was the first of the chapters on the Arabian culture, he had given a sort of diachronic view of the evolution of Magian thought over the centuries. In this chapter, he gives a kind of a synchronic view of the structure of Magian consciousness. And I would like to suggest that in this chapter, I think what's happening is Spengler is giving us an analysis of the Magian consciousness structure as a whole. And it's a type of analysis of, it's a type of consciousness structure that I think Gebser, in his ever-present origin, overlooked. I think the problem with Gebser's model in ever-present origin is that the problem with all such models is that they tend to be linear, and they tend to suggest a progression of stages moving upward gradually and irreversibly. And Gebser's model moves from the magical consciousness structure of primitive man, primitive and aboriginal man, to the mythical consciousness structure which originates in Mesopotamia, with Egypt and Mesopotamia, to the mental consciousness structure which comes in with the Greeks and is continued on by the Northern Europeans. But the reality is that history, as it has unfolded, has not moved in quite such a linear, smooth fashion. And I think what we have actually is, with the advent of the mythical consciousness structure in Mesopotamia and Egypt, we have a structure that is coherent, that is clear, very much like Gebser says, but then with the mental consciousness structure that is brought in by the Greeks, we have, after that period, somewhat of a regression, or at least a retrieval, with the Judeo-Christian Islamic Zoroastrian world, a regression to the mythical consciousness structure again, or at least it should be presented as a kind of the Magian soul that Spengler presents here in this chapter should be thought of, I think, as a kind of mythical consciousness structure phase 2, insofar as it comes out of the same region. It's the homeland of the Magian consciousness that Spengler discusses, the Magian soul as he calls it, comes out of exactly the same region that the mythical consciousness structure came into being, as described by Gebser, that is to say in Mesopotamia and Egypt. That is precisely the region from Persia to Constantinople, and in the south down to Arabia, that the Magian civilization originates here. So it should be thought of as a kind of second generation transformation of the mythical consciousness structure that comes in after the first phase, mental consciousness structure phase 1, Gebser should have said and specified but did not. It should be mental phase 1, then we get mythical phase 2 with the Magian, and then with the Faustian we get the mental consciousness structure phase 2, which is more or less what Gebser means when he says when he talks about the perspectival phase of the mental consciousness structure. This is really corresponds to Spengler's description of the Faustian structure as that of infinite space. So it moves more or less in this way, and I think one of the other problems with Gebser's model is that it, in addition to its being too smooth and linear, is that it doesn't take the Dark Ages into account like Spengler's model does. Spengler's model is a model that is much closer to the reality of the way history has unfolded in terms of the rise and falls of these civilizations, their rises and falls. And Gebser's model doesn't take into account that these consciousness structures are punctuated by Dark Ages, and that what Spengler is talking about by the fall of a civilization is really the slide down into the Dark Age. The first Dark Age that appears on the horizon in 1200 BC really is the collapse of the mythical consciousness structure, the collapse of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian culture worlds, that collapses into a pralaya. We get a huge Völkerwanderung with the Sea Peoples, 1200 BC. Then we get the rise of a new civilization, a number of new civilizations simultaneously. The classical, the Hindu, the Chinese, and the Mesoamerican all come into being roughly at about the same time here, roughly 1200 BC. And then after they have cycled through their metabolism and come down to the end of their arcs, then we get, with the German Völkerwanderung, we get the disintegration into another Dark Ages and the end the second generation of civilization. Then with the Faustian civilization, we begin to get a third generation of civilizations with the Faustian and Russian civilizations, and so on. So I think Spengler's model actually fits better than Gebser's model fits with the actual unfoldings of these civilizations. But be that as it may, then Spengler in this chapter then moves on to an analysis of the Magian soul, the Magian consciousness structure, by stating that he starts off with an analysis of this idea of the cavern. The basic structure of the Magian civilization is that it is governed by the prime symbol of the cavern, the world as a cavern. And it's interesting, by the way, that Gebser opens his book, Ever-Present Origin, with a description of the cavern and the cavern consciousness, which he identifies not with the Magian, but with the magical consciousness structure, insofar as the earliest civilization comes out of the cave, the culture emerges out of the caves of the Paleolithic, and Gebser sees the cavern perfectly exemplifying the spacelessness and directionlessness of the magical consciousness structure, which is completely indifferent in terms of its orientation in space and time, and sees space and time as an interpenetrating web, a mesh of forces that are intersecting and interpenetrating, so that they don't have any kind of directionality to them. And he also sees Hindu civilization as a regression to the cavern, to the magical cavern consciousness structure, its mentality. So Spengler then discusses this cavern idea, and he says that whereas the way that Vaksein, waking being, was structured for the Magian was in such a way that it distinguished, as did the mythical consciousness structure, between a macro oversoul and a microsoul of the human consciousness. Spengler points out that whereas for classical man we had waking being was characterized by the tension between form and matter, and for a Faustian man, waking being is characterized by the tension between force and mass. For the waking being of the Magian man, the tension is between pneuma and psyche, between the cosmic oversoul, the pneumatic spirit, and the individual psyche. In Hebrew, this is the ruach and the nefesh, the wind and the breath soul, you might say. And that this, and he also says that the other aspect of this is that this type of consciousness absolutely precludes the possibility of the formation of an ego, an individual ego in our Western Faustian consciousness sense of an I as a unique, willing entity that is capable of forming its own opinions and becoming its own authority and originating its own ideas. That doesn't exist in the Magian consciousness structure. The whole idea of the Magian consciousness is that the I is actually part of a we, a pneumatic we that has that is rooted in the pneuma, the spirit, the macro soul, that has descended down and united a consensus community of believers. As Christ says, where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. That's the Magian idea, and there is no such thing in this culture, nor could there ever have been, of intellectual property. And Spengler at one point then moves into a discussion about how the idea of this culture is that the Word of God is received as a text. It descends down, this pneuma descends down, and the Messiah, Redeemer figure, the Saushant, the Barnasha, the Anthropos, is the incarnation of this pneuma, just as John says in the John Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word came down and dwelt amongst us. The Word became flesh. This is the idea that this pneuma is incarnate in a Messiah Redeemer figure, but it also holds the group together, and it reveals itself. The truth of God reveals itself. It selects this or that individual and descends down and speaks through him, so that when the Muhammad recites a Quran, he is uttering the word of God. This is not his intellectual property. You can't take a copyright on it. The way that Descartes says, and it's decisive, that he says, I think, therefore I am. Notice the inflection there. That is the enunciation of what Rudolf Steiner calls the consciousness soul, the Faustian idea of intellectual property. I speak as an ego, not the spirit or the muses. The muses do not sing in me. The spirit does not speak through me. I am responsible for my own ideas. That's what Descartes is uttering there. That's what the essence of that idea is, that demarcates it from these older ideas, especially these Magian ideas, that when truth speaks, it speaks through the individual as a mouthpiece, a vessel. And when the Spirit descends in the individual in a superfluity of abundance, you get the deeds of a Samson, or the utterances of a Mohammed, or the sufferings of a Job. These are all the results of the Spirit descending in and moving through the individual. And so we have in this tradition the idea of a revealed text, a sacred, magical text that is the Word of God. It has descended to the individual complete and is not in any need of improvement. This is a society in which the ancestors are still remain very heavily present over the society, and as a result, if you want to make any changes, if any new ideas want to be added to the canon, they have to take on the guise of an authoritative individual. So there developed, as Spengler says in this tradition, a strong oratorical tradition of exegesis, of commentaries. And so in the late classical writers we get commentaries on Aristotle, and then we get commentators on commentators. In the Jewish community we get the Mishnah coming into being as a commentary on the Talmud. We get the exegetical traditions, the long, of course, in Islam there's a long tradition of exegeses and interpretations of these, of the Quran, of Muhammad, of these original ideas. And so the idea of the book is that truth is revealed and perfect for all time, but that the inspired individual can go back and interpret it to see how it is relative to the contemporary situation. And so new ideas then are slipped in insofar as they are adhered to an authoritative name. The Gospel according to Mark, it doesn't matter whether Mark was a real individual or not in this tradition, or whether there was any Mark. It is that the personage known as Mark vouches for that tradition of thinking that's associated with the Mark canon, the Mark school, or the Johannine school. It doesn't matter. In our sense, we want to know whether John was the author of the John Gospel. Is this the same John that was the author of the book of Revelation and the epistles of John? In reality, probably not. These are all written by different individuals who invoke the name of John as the authority behind which these ideas are linked, as exegeses of this point of view. And so there is no sense of individuality. These are all consensus communities. There are no intellectual ideas in terms of unique, original, innovative utterances of individuals. The copyright idea could never have occurred in the Magian civilization as the result of this. So that's his analysis of part of the structure of the Magian mentality. And he says the other thing about the world of Magian mankind is that it is filled with a fairy tale feeling. The whole world is this magical realm of amulets and talismans, mysterious lands, cities, buildings, secret letters, Solomon's seal, the philosopher's stone. You get the myth that under the hill of Golgotha there's a cavern with mysterious treasures, and the bones of Adam exist underneath this hill. This is perfectly captured in the Arabian romances of the Arabian Nights, this realm of Aladdin's cave with all of its treasures and treasures and amulets everywhere. So it is truly a magical world, and in a sense it is a kind of retrieval of the magical consciousness structure on the inside of an updated version of the mythical consciousness structure, so that the world is a cave in which the forces of light and darkness do battle for possession over the soul of man, and light is associated with the pneuma, the world spirit, and the individual soul is associated with the psyche, in whom these different substances, there is no conception of will in this culture. I will this, I will that. It is substances that are transformed insofar as they are penetrated by degrees of the spiritual substance, the pneuma, the ruach, that which descends into man and fills him up in varying degrees with divine inspiration. So there is this magical vision in this cavern consciousness structure. The other thing about the other constitutive structural feature of the architecture of the Magian, the anatomy of the Magian consciousness, is this idea that it even thinks of time in terms of it. Time is cavern-like for this civilization. There's a definite beginning and a definite ending to everything that takes place in the realm of actuality. So we have this idea that we have always a definite genesis and a definite apocalypse. In all of these traditions, whether we're talking about the Zoroastrian or the Jewish or the Christian, they all have this idea that the world originated at a specific date, And the Jews are already working out in the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin, that the world began in 4004 BC. We saw already with the Zoroastrians that it unfolded over a cosmic arc of exactly 12,000 years. There's a definite beginning and a definite ending, and the beginning and the ending are coterminous also with the creation of mankind and his end, his disintegration. So we have this definite arch of time and this thinking of the world in terms of these non-repeatable intervals. So let's see.